Continuing to rail on the American dream, there's an aspect of it that is very, very rarely discussed. I think most of what I've already said on the subject has been pretty well covered long before I was around to comment on it. Langston Hughes, by the way, should be required reading. But there's one aspect of this idea that we personally will rise out of our conditions on the strength of our merits to economic, social, and political success. There's an aspect of this that I don't hear discussed very often, and haven't encountered a lot of written discussion of it, sifting back through the past 200-odd years of American writing. And that is that it is deeply cynical. Seems counterintuitive, at least at first glance. The idea that we can... Okay, here comes the Fight Club reference that I'm sure has been running through at least a few heads as I've been working through this series. The idea that that we can be rock stars and movie stars, and we are unique, beautiful snowflakes that will be appreciated and appropriately compensated for our uniqueness and beautifulness. That sounds pretty idealistic. Calling this dream, or more appropriately, this tentpole of cultural myth, calling it idealistic, requires conceding to a level of narcissism that we would generally be very, very uncomfortable embracing directly. The hero or heroine of our story, born in poverty, living in desperation. Oh, wait, but that would involve acknowledging that there is poverty and desperation in America. Moving right along, born in poverty and desperation that exists purely for rhetorical purposes because God forbid we acknowledge that it actually exists, or that those conditions are common enough that most of us can identify with it. Our protagonist is born in poverty and desperation, and through a combination of ingenuity and hard work, transcends their conditions to live in the splendor and opulence that they really deserve, that they merit. Because they earned it, because they worked so very hard for it, we can't resent them for their success. I've already tipped my hand a little bit with that comment about actually acknowledging that conditions of poverty and desperation exist in order for our story to have a setting for its beginning, but our protagonist begins as one of many living in such conditions, and in our story is the only one to escape said conditions. Which begs the question of, what about everyone else? When our diamond in the rough escapes their conditions of fear, hunger, disenfranchisement, of being a recipient of all the ire and adversity that our country has to offer, when they rise out of those conditions, what happens to the rest of the people in the story? What happens to the extras in this movie? Even in this fantasy that we know, statistically, demographically, is a fantasy. The overwhelming majority of the people in the story are fucked. If we were pitching this in fairy tale form, the evil queen is not overthrown. Snow White just becomes significantly and sufficiently well enfranchised within the regime of the evil queen to avoid most of the conditions of misery that her reign perpetuates. If we were to draw from older mythic material, the hero, rather than slaying the dragon or the troll and thus liberating the village from the terror of its presence in their day-to-day lives, rather than slaying the monster, the hero relocates, moves to another village, and sets himself up as a significant member of a community that doesn't have a problem with dragons or trolls. I think we'd find it even harder to identify with Beowulf if his solution was to show up, say, oh shit, Grendel? He eats people? You've got a people-eating problem here. And this has been going on how long? Fuck that, I'm gone. That is what the hero in the story of the American Dream does. That is exactly what they do. This is why it's deeply cynical. This is why I say it's deeply cynical as well as obviously narcissistic. The idea of improving the conditions from which the hero would hope to escape is never even broached. It's never even entertained as a possibility. Thing is, there is language in our political rhetoric for describing people who suggest that maybe conditions can be improved. We don't call them idealists. We call them one of two things, depending on how red-blooded we are. We call them, if we're being a little gentle, socialists. Or, if we're being a little more honest about where our rhetoric is coming from, communists.